Appropriation Bills number 2, 2013-14 and the Appropriation Parliamentary Departments Bill number 1, 2014. The member for Fadden.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to lend some comment on the government's budget and associated appropriation bills, and I think it is generous to conclude that the bills show that Labor's financial and budget management at best is in complete and utter chaos. The budget does nothing for Australian families to deal with the rising cost of living. It does nothing to improve services. It delivers more debt. It delivers more deficit. It has more broken promises. It has greater taxes, and there is more uncertainty. This is now 6 years. This is the 6th budget I've spoken on. 6 years of chaos, debt, and the associated spin that the Labor Party puts on it. And can I say, Australians have had a gutful, and they deserve a stable and a competent government, and this budget has failed. It delivers a gross debt that will breach the $300 billion ceiling within the forward estimates. This is its 5th record deficit in 5 years, and there are 2 more deficits to come. Indeed, the nation's largest deficits on history have all been on this Treasurer's watch. There is no credible path to surplus. Even Labor's much-promised surplus in 3 years' time now is based on carbon price assumptions that are patently ridiculous, that the carbon price will be $25 a tonne in 17-18, though it's linked to the European scheme that is currently $5. So a 500% increase is how this government is hoping to get back into surplus. Can I say the member for North Sydney was right? The member for Lilly, the Treasurer Wayne Swan, will never deliver a surplus. Labor will never deliver a surplus. It hasn't delivered one since 1989, since the member for Longman, Wyatt Roy, was born. And it won't deliver a surplus, and we're kidding ourselves to think it may. Tax cuts have been scrapped. Family payments have been scrapped. There are $25 billion in higher taxes. There's $100 million of spending on government advertising. The hubris, considering the 2007 election commitments on government advertising, is something to truly, truly behold. Last year, the Treasurer forecast an underlying surplus of $1.5 billion, and what did he deliver? A deficit of $19.4 billion. Next financial year, 13-14, a deficit of $18 billion is projected. Every single Labor budget is a massive deficit. It simply can't be believed. Their surplus coming out to 15-16 of $800 million is simply and utterly farcical. With gross debt heading towards $1/3 trillion, borrowings at almost $50 million a day, it is little wonder that Australians are sick and tired of the mismanagement of this government. The government would have us believe that the situation is parlous because revenues have collapsed by $17 billion. If that was the case, and it's not, but if it was, with a $19.4 billion deficit, you'd still be in deficit. The issue isn't that revenues have collapsed. The issue is this government cannot stop spending. Revenue 13-14 is $80 billion more than the last year of the coalition government. Fact beyond dispute. The problem is the spending is $120 billion more. The last budget of the coalition government actually had a $20 billion surplus. This government is delivering almost a $20 billion deficit. The issue is not revenue. $80 billion more revenue. The issue is the government's poor spending, poorly targeted spending, poorly outlined spending. The government can't stop spending money that, frankly, it doesn't have. Spending as a percentage of GDP remains higher than in the last 2 years of the coalition government, as it has every year under Labor. There's not a revenue problem, it is a spending problem. The government isn't proceeding with Family Tax Benefit A, which announced in the budget worth $2.5 billion. Its promised tax cuts have been abolished, reminiscent of the tax cuts under Keating that were law, LAW. I think we all remember that. The mining tax was supposed to share the benefits of the boom, yet the most poorly designed tax in the history of Christendom has raised literally nothing. Company tax cuts that were to commence in 12/13 have been cancelled. The blowout in our borders is legion. Blowout costs of at least $4.7 billion since the last budget, with costs now approaching $10 billion because this government found a solution and created a problem. Over 40,000 illegal entrants, i.e. people who have come without a visa, have arrived because this government has put the sugar on the table. And of course the cost of living, which is killing families, carbon tax driven in many cases. It is a legacy that the nation is not proud of. It's a legacy that the nation is ashamed of. If we look in my area of defence, the story is no better. The budget committed $25.434 billion to defence next financial year, which is an increase in CPI 2.25%, up from $24.482 billion. Now, you'll forgive me if I don't share the enthusiasm of commentators who go, this is great for defence. No, you've just kept it at CPI. What happened to the much vaunted phrases that Labor would guarantee 3% real increase? Gone, all gone. That they would guarantee 2% of GDP, all gone. There is modest at best increases to DMO's acquisition and sustainment budgets, $400 million to the acquisition budget, and the sustainment budget has gone from $5.095 billion in 12/13 to $5.63 billion in 13/14, an increase of $600 million. But in terms of both acquisition and sustainment, the government has stated in the budget papers that funding will rise by $1 billion for acquisition and $1.7 billion for sustainment by 2016-17. Yet, prior to this budget, prior to this small increase in line with CPI, this Labor government, as statements of fact, has cut upwards of $25 billion from defence in the last 5 years. And I expect that number may increase when Mark Thompson from ASPI brings down his much anticipated, indeed relied upon, defence budget analysis document. By my calculations, the cuts that this Labor government has made defence endure will be at least $28 billion. Staggering to think that our national security would be cut by that extreme level. This financial year we're in now has got the lowest expenditure in defence in GDP terms since 1938, since pre-war, at 1.56% of GDP. It is a national and utter disgrace. DSTO's funding remains relatively flat, with funding next year reducing before going back up again. A major theme in Labor's budget, can I just say. Defence is now in a position where much of its force is hollowed out, where individual units and formations are receiving cuts of up to 30%, where reserve forces are not having enough days to make the minimum mandatory amount of 20 days, where cadets, the single most important youth development activity in the country, where cadet instructor days are being cut by 30%. It is a disgrace. The centrepiece of the government's budget, announced in the white paper which preceded the budget by a few weeks, was the acquisition of 12 Growler aircraft. And it was hilarious to watch the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister release the Defence white paper out at Fairburn in the hangar, spent over $150,000 flying in some C-17, some gear on board, some fighters. So the setting looked grand, nothing like a PM behind a lectern, with war-fighting equipment behind it. Can't find the money to fund it, but he can find the money for a PR stunt. Pathetic. And the centrepiece was 12 electronic attack Growler aircraft, Super Hornets configured for electronic attack. Yet the budget papers reveal those aircraft will cost $2.9 billion over 9 years. So you'd expect the budget to show how it will be paid for. Wrong. Don't listen to what this miserable government says. Look at what they fund. If you're not talking dollars, you're not talking strategy. $2.9 billion over 9 years, and there's an equity injection of $200 million in 2014-15. Where's the other $2.7 billion coming from? Absorbed costs. Another way of saying cuts. Defence will have to cut by $2.7 billion to absorb this new capability. And to put this point beyond any reasonable doubt, the budget papers themselves state the following, and I quote, "The majority of the cost of this measure will be met from within the existing resources of the Department of Defence, with an additional $200 million provided in 14-15. Direct quote, budget paper number 2, page 288. Defence is being cut by $2.7 billion. That's what this Labor government does. Don't look at what they say, look at what they do. $2.7 billion in cuts again. But what is particularly vexing, and what annoys me about this miserable bunch, is before the 2007 and the 2010 election they promised there would be free health care for ADF dependents, spouses and their kids, ostensibly wives and husbands and children that get moved around the country in defence of our nation. Yet it was delayed and deferred last financial year. Nowhere is ADF healthcare discussed in the budget. Nowhere can I find it in the budget papers. But this morning we find an announcement on the ADF healthcare website saying that that trial has been delayed until December 2013. Just appalling. You're never going to do it. Never. You made a promise to ADF spouses and their kids that you would look after them in terms of free access to health care, and you're never going to do it, and you didn't even have the courage to come out and say it. You hid it on the Defence Healthcare website. Didn't have the courage in the budget, didn't have the courage in media releases, hid it on the website. Completely and utterly appalling. Well, there is a better way. And in 4 months' time, the Australian people will have the opportunity to exercise their democratic vote on a better way, on a way that doesn't cut health care for ADF dependents and their spouses, a way that provides certainty in terms of our defence budget and our national security. In little over 100 days' time, Australians will have their say on abolishing the carbon tax, on getting rid of a mining tax that does nothing except introduce sovereign risk into our country, about having substantial relief from cost of living by getting rid of that miserable carbon tax. Australians will have their say in over 100 days by having income tax cuts without a carbon tax. They will have that choice between a government that cuts and wastes and spends and cannot be trusted and is reckless, to a coalition that is promising stability, no surprises, no nastiness, and income tax cuts without a carbon tax. It's fully funded commitments. The offset reductions were announced in the Leader of the Opposition's budget in reply speech. Australians will have the opportunity to have their say. And that opportunity will be to you on a government that's taking you towards $1/3 trillion in gross debt, or an incoming coalition government that will actually increase productivity, that will get rid of $1 billion of red tape every year and green tape, that will get the nation working again, that will increase productivity, that will begin to get the budget back into surplus and to pay off the crippling debt that Labor has left it. That's the opportunity Australians will have in a little over 100 days. A choice between a strong, prosperous economy or an economy at present where companies and small business are simply just hanging off or hanging on. They'll have a choice between a government that continues to recklessly spend versus one that will have a commission of audit that will look at all the unnecessary expenditure. A government that is addicted to public servants compared to a coalition that will reduce the public service by $12,000 or 12,000 personnel through natural attrition. They will have the choice in 100 days on a government that is reckless, spending, indebting, versus a coalition that is prudent, sensible and growing. Bring on the next 100 days.